Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I am the ding 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 ding. I'm by am ding ding ding. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I'm by ding ding. Ding 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 ding. I'm ding 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 ding. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I am the ding 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 ding. I'm nine nine. I'm nine nine nine. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I'm Bambai. I'm nine nine nine. Ding 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 ding. I'm nine ding 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 ding. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I am the ding 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 ding. I'm Bambai. I'm nine nine. I'm the ding 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 ding. I nine 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 nine. I'm the ding 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 ding. I'm Bambai. I nine nine. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I'm the ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. Ding 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 ding. I am the ding 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 ding. I'm Bambai. I'm Bambai. Ding 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 ding. I'm nine nine. I'm nine nine nine. Ding 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 ding. I'm Bambai. I'm nine nine nine. Ding 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 ding. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome. This week's parsha is Vayigash, and we're going to look at a very, very interesting idea, and that is crying. Why would I come up with this kind of theme? So we see that in this parsha, it begins with Yehuda approaching Yosef. Of course, he doesn't know that it's Yosef. He thinks it's the ruler, the viceroy of Egypt. And Yosef has been engineering this whole escapade in order to move the brothers to doing complete tshuva for having sold him. And now he's holding Benjamin in jail. And Yehuda has promised his father Yaakov to bring Benjamin back. And so he is pleading to take Benjamin's place. I'll be your slave, your servant, and just let Benjamin go home. It will cause my father too much grief. And at this point, Yosef, the text says, Yosef could not hold back anymore. He now felt that Yehuda offering himself was a rectification for having abandoned him as a brother. And here he's offering his life instead of Benjamin's. So here he reveals himself after this long story plays itself out. He reveals himself to his brothers. And in the text, it says he cried 3 different times during this process of revealing himself. When he first reveals himself, he first of all, he just burst out into tears. He cannot hold them back. And then he cries again. And then when they bring Benjamin in, he cries again 3 times. But this is not all. If we look at the 4 Torah portions where Joseph plays a major part, in 3 of them, they have him crying at different times. And altogether, the Torah records 8 different times that Joseph cries. Now, if it was once or twice, maybe we wouldn't think so much about it. But here we see Joseph is crying 8 different times. So I thought it would be very good to delve into this idea of crying in general, and of course how it affects us and what we can learn from this, and especially how it relates to Joseph. So we see that Joseph cries here 3 times. He cries when he first sees his brothers. He had to leave the room, and he cried. When Yaakov passes away, he cries. When he meets Yaakov, he cries. And again, the Torah accounts to him all of this crying. So here we see that there's something very, very essential to Joseph's whole being about crying. Now, first of all, we'll mention that along with so many other secrets in the Torah, there is a whole mathematical strata, sometimes they're called the Bible codes, and they all have to do with numbers. So we know that the number 8 always refers to infinity, or beyond the usual cycle or process, which is represented by the number 7. That's why every week is 7 days, and Shabbat is the 7th day. It's like a world to itself. The 8th is one beyond it. It's eternal. It's infinite. It goes beyond what can ordinarily be expected. That's why the covenant that every male child goes to on the 8th day, because it represents a type of relationship between us and God that is not like an ordinary relationship. It goes beyond ordinary relationships. So it says in the Talmud that when the temple was destroyed, in a sense, many of we're talking symbolically, the gates in heaven closed for many, many different things. But it says the one thing that the gate is never closed for is a gate of tears. The gate of tears are always open. And just like they move us, they move God. They move the upper worlds. So this is a very, very important idea. Now, it's probably very, very politically incorrect right now and culturally incorrect, but if we go back 1, 2, 3, 4 generations, there was an expression, big boys don't cry. And that was supposed to be some kind of a positive expression, but obviously it's not. In fact, encouraging people not to access that depth of emotion is not a very positive thing at all. So here we see Joseph is crying in many, many different circumstances. So before we focus on Joseph, if we look at the rest of the Torah and the whole Bible, so there are many, many different people who are crying at different times. And so it's very instructional because there are many, many different types of tears. And I'm sure we all know this from ourselves, just the two that are the most obvious, that there's tears of pain, frustration, shock, sadness, but there's also tears of joy, tears of being overwhelmed either for the negative or in many cases for the positive. In fact, many people have an easier time crying for positive reasons, being overwhelmed by the beauty or the joy or the excitement of a situation. So we see that, I'm just looking at my notes for 1 second. So we see that Yosef's father, so he cries when he first meets Rachel, his soulmate, because he is so overwhelmed with the experience of just knowing intuitively on the spot that this is the love of his life. So it says the first thing he did is he cries when he sees her. And also when Yaakov meets Esav, now this is somewhat unexpected, because Yaakov and Esav have a very, very difficult relationship. But when they finally got together after many decades, it says they both cried. They both cried. And actually, there's a disagreement among the sages whether Esav really meant those tears. Some of the midrashim is just the opposite, is that he actually tried to harm Yaakov. But a very, very interesting thing is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the main figure and the author of the tradition of the Zohar, says even though it's a known fact that Esav hated Yaakov, in this particular case, he really cried. He cried from emotion and brotherhood with Yaakov. The first person we see in the Torah who cries is Hagar, when Sarah, in a sense, forces Hagar out of the house. So we see that she cries, and here it's out of desperation. She just doesn't know what to do, and she feels that she and Yishmael are going to die. And so she cries from just, this is beyond me. I need help here. So each one of these cryings is a different type of crying. We see also a very different type of crying is with Samson and Delilah. Delilah, and the story is much deeper than a surface that we could get into right now. But Delilah cries because Samson won't reveal the source of his strength. And here we see a very deceptive type of crying. We'll call it a fake type of crying in order to get something from it, get some reaction from it. We see that David, when his best friend Jonathan is killed in battle, David breaks out in tears. And we also see that Hannah, who was not able to have children, and she finally just feels, I'm like at the end here. And she just opens her heart and prays to God and cries. So here we see all kinds of different type of tears. And I'm sure most of the people watching right now and myself at different times, we have cried for these different reasons. As I said before, some people have a very, very hard time crying, at least physical tears. Many, many people cry on the inside. And in a sense, that is also crying. That is also a positive type of thing. But there's no doubt that when real tears fall, it's a sign of overwhelming emotions for either the positive or the negative. And so it's really all positive in a sense to cry. And there's a beautiful teaching about this, that the root for crying, to cry, is in Hebrew is a bet chaf hey. So that's bacha, to cry. Numerically, that equals 27. And we have a general principle in Jewish numerology, in gematria, that you can always add 1 for the word itself. So if you add 1 to 27, you have 28. And 28 equals the word koach, strength. So here we return to Yosef, just as an example, is that really Yosef's strength was his ability to cry. And it's true with us also. We quoted before, big boys don't cry. Well, that is just, it's so unproductive. That here, what we're learning is that in many cases, a person's strength is when they allow themselves to feel deeply and to let it come out. So here we're trying to learn about personal growth. And so what we see about Yosef is here he is the ruler of Egypt. And if you follow these portions, he was not wishy-washy. He was a very strong figure when he's taken into Potiphar's house. It's like so obvious to Potiphar that he knows what he's doing and that he can be in charge. And he gave over his whole household to Yosef. When he was put into jail, the warden of the jail turned everything over to Yosef to run. And then Pharaoh does the same thing. So Yosef was a strong character. He was, his word was his command. He commanded the greatest empire at that time was Egypt. And yet we see he was very sensitive at the same time. This is very, very similar to King David. King David was an incredible warrior. He fought many, many wars, united Jerusalem, united the tribes. He began to expand the borders to the borders that were promised to Israel. And at the same time, he was the greatest poet. He was the greatest musician. And for anyone who reads Tehillim, the Psalms, so the depths of a feeling that David reaches 3,000 years later, it still moves us. So much of our prayers and our rituals are based around the Psalms to this day. And actually in many, many different Christian churches, a good part of the services are made up of the Psalms. And of course, in Islam, David is accepted as a prophet. So here we see that many times a person's strength is the ability to cry. Now we might ask an interesting question. and I didn't even mention all the different people who are crying in the Tanakh. But what about laughter? How many times do we see laughter? Well, in the Chumash, it's really around one incident, and that's the birth of Isaac. Yitzhak. Yitzhak literally means he will laugh. That's his name, Yitzhak. He will laugh. And it comes from that when Avram hears that he'll have a son, he laughed. And when Sarah heard that she will have a son, she laughed. And there's much discussion about what types of laughter these were. But God comes and says, when this child is born, name him Yitzhak. And when he was born, so it brought Sarah so much joy. She said, everyone will laugh with me in joy that I could have a child at such a late stage in my life. But if you look at the rest of the Chumash, we don't see laughter. And if we look through the whole Bible, we see a lot of crying and crying out. Many, many times in the Torah, like scores and scores and scores of time through the prophets, through the Psalms, different characters, there's a crying out to Hashem. Now, these aren't necessarily physical tears, but it is a cry from the heart. And remember what we said in the beginning, that the gates of tears are never closed. And that includes crying on the inside. So what can we learn from this? That there's so much crying in the Bible and very little laughter. Now, one of the places that it is mentioned is in one of the Psalms. And for an observant Jew, we say this psalm before we say the after blessing over food on Shabbat and holidays. It's one of the what's called Shir Hamalot, one of the songs of ascent. And one of them is that when we're brought back to Zion, we will be like dreamers, and our mouths will be filled with laughter. Schok pinu. Our mouths will be filled with laughter. And yet, that's for, in a sense, it's actually happening now. But for most of Jewish history, it was something that was put off to the future. We were in exile for thousands of years. But now we're here. So when we say this Song of Ascents, it is so meaningful because we are here. And it is a source of tremendous joy, tremendous joy. But what we can learn from this is something very, very important, is for many, many, many people, life is very challenging. And there's so many frustrations and so many obstacles and so many wars and so much sickness, and especially now, the pandemic is like peaking everywhere, and just so many troubles in the world, that to be happy takes work. Now, many people think either I'm a happy person or I'm an unhappy person. That's just the way I am. I'm either an optimist or a pessimist, and that's just my nature. But we don't really believe in this, is that we all have what to be grateful for. We all have what to be happy about. We all have what to be hopeful and optimistic about. Many people prefer to see the glass as half empty or mostly empty. But to be happy, it's an avoda. It's a work. You have to work at being happy. And we can do it. We can definitely do it. And in fact, on a daily level, it's probably the most important choice that we make every day. Every day we can choose to be upset, sad, depressed, etc. Or we can choose not to be like an ostrich with our head in the sand and pretend that we're not challenged personally and the world isn't challenged. But what's priority here? So we always have that choice. So it says in the Zohar, a very, very important statement. It says, one part of my heart is crying, and one part of my heart is laughing. So the simple understanding is like King Solomon said in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a time for everything under heaven, time for this and its opposite. And there's a time for crying, and there's a time for laughter. This in itself is a great wisdom to be tuned into what is the energy at the moment. How many times have we gone to a celebration and inside we're totally depressed? Or the opposite, we go, God forbid, we go to a funeral and inside we're very happy about something. Okay, maybe on the outside we put on a certain face. So to know when to be happy and when to laugh and when to cry is a great wisdom. But it's much deeper than that. We learn that at a certain level, and I learned this from Rav Shlomo Carlebach, is that what King Solomon really means, what the Zohar means, is that you can laugh and cry at the same time. And the way Reb Shlomo explained it is, when I look at the world and I see what a broken place it is, how much pain and suffering and unhappiness and frustration, how can I not feel broken inside? On the other hand, when I look at the world and I see what a beautiful place it is, and how many beautiful people and how many reasons to be grateful and joyous, how can I not be laughing? So this is the image of breaking a glass at a wedding. For those who are familiar with a Jewish wedding, at the peak of joy, the peak of joy, we break a glass under the canopy, under the chuppah, to indicate that until the temple is rebuilt, there is a certain brokenness in the world. The rebuilding of the temple represents redemption. They will come together, the temple and redemption and the Mashiach, the Messiah. So breaking a glass at the wedding is, we can be at the same time in the height of happiness, and yet there's still that place that we recognize the brokenness. So I want to end with one more beautiful thing, is that in the prophet Jeremiah explains, just to go back one or two parshas, that Rachel, when she gave birth to Benjamin, she died in childbirth as they came into Israel. And even though all the other patriarchs and matriarchs are buried in Hebron, only Rachel is buried by herself by Bethlehem. And the prophet Jeremiah addresses this and says that Rachel is crying for her children. And Jeremiah comforts the soul of Rachel and say, your tears are not in vain, that your children will return to their borders. V'shavu banim ligvulam. Your children will return to the borders. And it's your tears that are paving the way. So a very, very beautiful Kabbalistic hint here is that the word for tear in Hebrew, dima, equals 119 in numerology. 119. So if we assume when a person cries, there's a tear from the right eye and a tear from the left eye, there are two tears. So if you multiply 119 by 2 equals 238, equals the name Rachel. And so in a sense, her crying is almost the archetype of all crying. And who is the son of Rachel? Yosef. Now, you could say it's because of Yosef's crying that Rachel is crying, but Rachel is the mother. Where did Yosef learn the depths of feeling? Is from his mother. And so there's a deep connection in the tears of Yosef and the tears of Rachel. So I want to end with a blessing. We're out of time. I want to end with a blessing that our tears matter. And our tears are a sign of strength, not weakness. And that we have the ability to cry over things that need to be cried over, but we also can cry tears of joy. So I just want to bless everyone that we have many opportunities to have this kind of overwhelming feeling of gratitude and appreciation, that we can cry a few tears in great joy.